The first sound that reached her, even before she saw the tangled remains of the building, was the hush, strangely soft for such a raw scene, as if sorrow itself had pressed its palm against the city's chest and told it to breathe quietly. The smell, though, was sharp. Dust, concrete, and some faint metallic tang she somehow tasted behind her teeth. Nora stepped off the fire engine with careful purpose, boots sinking into the gritty mud churned by the trucks and desperate feet before her. Sirens had faded to a low moan in the last block, and now the world had narrowed to the heavy shape of the ruined structure, shadows stretching from what once had been windows. Every other firefighter seemed already in motion, making urgent shapes through swirling dust. Above them, a haze of dawn pressed pale fingers against the bruised sky. But down here, the light was uncertain, splitting into shards off broken glass. She lingered at the edge. After all these years, some part of her wondered, will the first step always feel like falling? A gloved hand squeezed her shoulder, brief, almost hesitant, then was gone again, back into the flow of helmeted heads and radios crackling. It was only then that she noticed how everyone moved, purposeful and silent, as if any misplaced shout might tilt the precarious debris further into disaster. A pale scarf hung from the side mirror of a waiting ambulance, fluttering against the cold wind, a soft, useless thing in a world suddenly made of weight and jagged edges. Nora scanned the faces around her, feeling the old tension stir in her chest, the one that never quite left, no matter how many scenes like this she'd survived. She adjusted her gear, mind brushing across the map of training, memory, and names, some of whom she hardly dared to hope would walk out of this darkness with her. And what if the next breath she took carried the last calm she'd feel for hours or days? With that thought, she stepped forward, boots splashing through a puddle rimed with cement dust, and let herself become part of the day's uncertain work, her own silhouette now one more shadow among the ruins. It began with shouts, not panicked, but clear and clipped, each one carrying more information than fear. Instructions moved across the broken site like runners on a relay track. There. See that shift? Stabilize the southern wall before we get any closer, called a younger captain. Voice carried just above the grinding hum of saws biting into concrete. Nora watched as the team spread out into pairs, one half with shovels and stretchers, the other trailing with cables and blankets. They formed a line, passing heavy rescue tools, sometimes just a bottle of water or a flashlight, through hands thick with the grime of other emergencies. Radios snapped to life, static swallowed by urgent voices. Each detail felt counted. Oxygen tanks checked twice, lost time tallied in the set of someone's jaw. Here and there people knelt in wreckage, heads bowed in silent calculation, or low, hurried prayer. Every few seconds, debris shifted, and the world seemed to suck its breath tight, waiting to see if the floor above would finally give up, or hold. It always amazed her, the way strangers seemed to become kin in these moments, a silent pact binding them long before anyone asked. Nora found herself side by side with a woman whose name she didn't know, and a young man whose hands trembled only when he thought no one saw. She remembered to offer what little she could, a nod, a half smile, that quick clearing of her throat that meant, "I'm here with you," though words often crumbled as easily as the plaster beneath their boots. Time fragmented. Sometimes it felt like every sound. Cracking beams, a child's sob muffled by a scarf, the persistent wail of a search dog, was carving new grooves into her memory. But it was the teamwork that held her steady. A hose was hauled over, then handed to her, and she anchored it without thinking, heartbeat in her ears, while she locked eyes with the woman beside her. If one person's grip loosened, another tightened. And what if, in any other life, these hands had never met? Working as one, moving forward inch by fragile inch, they made space for each hope to breathe, even in the thickest dust. It happened quicker than a heartbeat, with only the softest warning. A groan from deep within the tangle of metal and stone, then a shudder, like the building itself was turning in uneasy sleep. Nora had been crouched, her hands steady as she guided a stretcher beneath a gap where voices whispered that survivors might be. For a split second, everything paused. Dust motes, suspended in a pale ray of sun filtering through the ruins, a voice crackling over the radio, her own breath caught between her teeth. Then, the world shifted with a thunderous snap. Masonry broke loose above her, a storm of brick and beam collapsing into the hollow void below. She tried to back away, calling a warning for those behind her, but her boots slipped on uneven ground slick with moisture, and in that brief helpless moment, she realized she could not outrun what was coming. It was as if time folded, layers of memory and muscle compressing into a single, raw instant when hope felt both impossible and necessary all at once. She did not remember the sound of her own voice as she fell, only a flurry of movement, the sharp sting across her knuckles as she covered her head, and a weight like the world itself settling atop her back. The chaos outside faded to a muffled rush, the furious pounding of 100 boots receding as the dust and darkness pressed close. Nora felt the rough edge of concrete against her shoulder, realized her legs were pinned, that she could not move except to squeeze her fingers into cold earth. Fear arrived unannounced, curling small and hot at the base of her throat, but she fought to keep her breathing slow, mind-skipping through training, old drills, words she'd said herself to frighten strangers. Above, muffled voices blurred together. What if no one heard her? What if she were forgotten beneath these shifting stones, only a name on a clipboard at the missing? But inside that fear, a tiny, stubborn ember remained. She was still here, and she would wait for the hands that would remember to look for her, somehow. Fear moved through her like a slow river, cold at first, threading around her pulse, making her skin prickle beneath the layer of sweat and grit. Darkness had settled thick and close, pressing in until she could barely see the battered sleeve of her own jacket, or the faint glimmer of her helmet light smudged against the slab overhead. There was the dull ache in her legs, now held tight beneath tons of ruined ceiling, and a sharper, silent panic rising behind her ribs. She found herself listening for her own breath, the ragged drag in, the shaky promise out, as if she could judge her chances of survival by its rhythm alone. Thoughts crowded her mind, some practical flashes about conserving air, keeping still, slowing her heart, but others more insistent and irrational. Would anyone know exactly where she was? Had she called out loud enough? She pictured distant voices echoing above, boots scuffing past, maybe not close enough to hear her, and that fear almost splintered her composure with its lonely sharpness. And what if rescue never came? What if everything she loved stayed on the other side of all this stone? But Nora was not built for surrender. Even as fear clawed at her edges, something stronger grew at her center, a will that refused to be bent by circumstance or pain. She remembered the first day she'd ever faced a fire, the way her hands shook. But she'd still moved forward, stubborn as a weed growing in cracked pavement. She forced herself to inventory her injuries. Pain, yes, but nothing that made her breath catch with terror. She flexed her fingers, found sensation, a cold reassurance. The training replayed in her mind, each careful lesson, another rung on a makeshift ladder leading up through darkness. She would count her breaths, she would focus on the faint threads of sound above, she would not let her mind run wild. Instead, she summoned the faces of those she'd helped over years, shivering mothers, startled children, the lonely elderly, and with each memory, a spark leapt to life. For them, for herself, she would hold on. And maybe, just maybe, the stubborn beat of her heart was enough to call someone home to her side. The world outside the collapsed building felt just as heavy but in a different way. Elaine moved through the chaos with a purpose sharpened by something older than urgency. Worry, and the stubborn ache that comes with loving someone you've watched walk out the door more than once, not knowing if they'd ever walk back in. She was no stranger here. Her coat was streaked with ash, her scarf askew against the cut of the wind, her hands chapped from work. Among firefighters, she was known, not by her badge, but by the way she always appeared when someone needed more than just a flame extinguished. Today, there was a quiver in her voice that she tried to disguise, with quick conversations and determined footsteps. The radio spat out 100 names and directions, hope tangled with the static. Elaine paused now and then at each cluster of rescuers, scanning faces, eyes searching for a sign, a gesture, even a familiar tilt of a helmet that might belong to him. The crush of people and machinery roared around her, everyone moving with the same desperate intent. But inside her chest, she felt every second contract and stretch, demanding answers she wasn't sure she'd get. It was the small details that caught her. The battered thermos left by an engine, the boot prints leading deeper into danger, the careful placement of gear set up for someone who had not yet come back. Each told its own story, but she was looking for the chapter that belonged to him. She asked after him, gentle but unyielding, voice always steady, never betraying how it trembled beneath the surface. What if, this time, she was already too late? A search dog barked suddenly, off to the side, drawing her gaze toward a patch of debris dusted by sunlight, and her heart hammered with hope and fear, so tightly wound, they felt the same. Deep down, it was not just his safety she searched for. It was the echo of all their unfinished words, and the soft, stubborn thread that still tied them together. The ache was constant, but so was the resolve. She would not leave him swallowed by silence. And what if, after all these years, she was the only one who could truly bring him back to herself? Elaine moved with careful steps, each one a silent plea as she made her way around the fractured skeleton of the building. The late morning sun tried to break through the dust, turning open wounds in the structure to harsh silver. Where others might have looked for visible signs, a gloved hand waving, a helmet caught on a beam, Elaine listened. Past the whine of drills and the strained voices on radios, she tuned herself to smaller, almost secret noises. There was a lull, a breathless pocket of waiting, when the crowd of responders shifted away from a certain patch. Here, half hidden beneath a sagging piece of wall, something called to her deep inside. At first it was just the scrape of loose stone settling, easily mistaken for another aftershock. She crouched, pressing her ear as close as she dared without drawing the worried glance of the safety officer. Her hand found the edge of a steel bar, cold and smooth beneath her palm, and she whispered his name softly into the shadows. A reply, a thread of sound, thin and almost imaginary, brushed her ear, so faint that she held her breath to be sure. There it was again. Not a word, not even a cry, but the unmistakable rhythm of purposeful tapping. 3 slow beats, a pause, then the echo of a knuckle or stone, steady as a pulse. Elaine blinked back tears and pressed both hands to the debris, leaning close enough to feel the cold seeping through her gloves. "I hear you," she murmured, voice trembling but sure. Hope flickered up, fierce and fragile, as she called for a rescue team to mark this spot. And what if no one else had slowed down long enough to find it? She pressed her forehead to her chilly hands, her heartbeat echoing the coded knocks from below, a secret language just for the two of them. In that moment, surrounded by chaos, she felt the line between fear and relief blur. She was not too late. Not today. Elaine steadied herself, taking a shallow breath that tasted like plaster and anticipation. She leaned closer to the cold, jagged seam between the world above and those hidden below. Her voice, soft and husky from hours of dust, slipped gently down through the crevice. "I'm here. I hear you," she said, the words folding warm over worry, a presence in the dark. Around her, the sight swelled with noise, the steady rhythm of tools, the sharp call of instructions, but for a moment she let her tone carry brighter than any siren. "Don't move. Help is coming. I won't leave this spot until you're safe." Her words traveled on hope, on memory, on the 1,000 quiet assurances she'd given him through years of late-night returnings and dangerous shifts. She pressed her palm to the jagged stone so he might sense it, an unseen hand through the dark, knowing sometimes it's not the message but the voice that keeps a person whole while waiting. Below, in the breathless hollow where Nora lay pinned, that voice slipped in through the cracks like spring air after a long, hard winter. Fear, simmering just beneath skin and bone, eased back a fraction, edged out by a recognition deeper than sight. Elaine's voice. There could be no mistaking it, even half lost to rumble and static. The words were steady, threaded with calm, she must have manufactured for Nora's sake alone. A prickling warmth spread through Nora's chest, enough to overpower the chill in her limbs. There were rules, she knew, about keeping quiet and conserving energy, rules about not giving in to hope too soon. But hope was stubborn, especially when carried in the voice of someone who promised not to give up. "I hear you too," Nora managed, lips close to the slab, letting the sound of her reply ride the narrow tunnel back above. For a heartbeat, the weight of rubble was no longer the only thing holding her together. It was that quiet promise, echoing where the world could not yet reach. Nora hadn't expected to hear anything but the hollow sounds of her own breath and the distant crumbling of stone. Lying there, half wrapped in the dusk and dust of the fallen world, she braced herself for a solitude so deep it might erase her completely. So when Elaine's voice seeped through the cracks, gentle, patient, as familiar as home, it startled her, scattering the dark thoughts that had begun to root around her heart. Her first instinct was disbelief. Perhaps her mind had conjured comfort out of nothing, the way a tired child imagines a lullaby. But the voice returned, clear and steady, cutting through the isolation. I'm here. I won't leave. It carried with it memories, moments of stubborn presence, the way Elaine could breathe calm into panic with nothing but a word. Nora blinked sticky dust from her lashes, and pressed her ear as close as she could to the cold stone, afraid even to exhale, lest the sound vanish like a dream at dawn. Relief didn't come all at once. Instead, it unfolded in careful layers. The first, a shivering gratitude that someone was near and aware of her pain. The second, a sharp, sudden warmth at realizing it was Elaine of all people, a person who understood her silences and her stubbornness better than she did herself. Nora even managed a soft huff of laughter, part sob, part memory, the kind of laugh that always found its way out of her after a crisis, thin but alive. The numbness in her limbs didn't fade, but the fear at her edges did, soothed by the certainty that she was not invisible, not lost. Of all the people out there, she whispered, voice fluttering like a moth in a jar. It had to be you. Above, she could imagine Elaine's patient half-smile, hear the steady promise that had anchored her through harder days. For the first time since the collapse, Nora let herself believe in the possibility of rescue, not just from the rubble, but from the quiet, growing ache of being forgotten. Elaine settled herself onto the cold ground, her back pressed against a splintered pillar. She ignored the rising discomfort, the bite of concrete and the throb in her knees. None of it mattered compared to what was buried beneath. In her palm, the radio buzzed with urgent requests, updates, promises that more help was coming, but she refused to pass along the usual reassurances just yet. Instead, she focused on strengthening her voice with certainty, letting every word drop like a weight through the fractured air. I'm not leaving you, Nora, she repeated. I'll be right here, every minute. Above ground, others came and went, and there were gentle attempts to move her aside, to offer her water or relief, but Elaine only shook her head. She brushed the edge of rubble with gentle fingers and spoke again, every syllable steady with quietly stubborn faith. There was a kind of power in her presence that outlasted fatigue or the chill of waiting, one Nora would recognize as the same power that got people through the longest nights. Beneath the debris, Nora clung to those words. Years of drills and rescues had taught her to expect efficiency, sometimes tenderness, but rarely the kind of fierce, unwavering loyalty Elaine poured into her promise. More than the light filtering between cracks or the distant clang of tools, it was Elaine's refusal to move that tethered her to hope. Time warped around their conversations, sometimes racing, sometimes stretching as slow as the drip of water nearby. Whenever despair threatened to slip into Nora's thoughts, Elaine's voice returned, simple and solid. You're not alone. You'll never be alone. The warmth of that echo defied the cold pressing in around her ankles. In the briefest flashes, Nora remembered nights when she'd sat with people for hours, refusing to let their fear win out, and understood with a rush of humility that kindness could loop back in ways both familiar and new. What if, in the end, the strongest promise anyone could offer was simply to stay? Time unfolded strangely, stretched and folded over itself in the cramped space between Nora and the shifting light above. The sun wandered across the sky, marking its journey more with the changing shadows on the debris than with any clock. Sometimes, whole minutes passed with neither woman saying a word, just the steady rhythm of breath and the faint creak of stones settling overhead. In those silences, a thread pulled tighter between them, woven from old memories, quiet trust, and the knowledge that some companionship needs no filling. When the pain in Nora's legs sharpened, or the space seemed to close tighter, Elaine would speak softly, a story from years back, an observation about the clouds, or a reminder to sip water from the canteen nudged closer through the rubble. And every so often, Nora offered her own brief answers, sometimes with wit dry as dust, sometimes with just the press of knuckles against stone in acknowledgement. No grand declarations grew between them, nothing loud or forced, only the slow, sturdy construction of faith. Each hour, Nora listened for Elaine's voice the way a tired traveler waits for the sound of rain after drought. Elaine, for her part, never let herself sound weary, and in her pauses, she listened for the whispered reassurances Nora could barely form. There was an intimacy to the hush, a shared shelter built right there amid the ruin. When others hurried by, delivering tools, mapping new rescue plans, Elaine would signal with a look or a nod that Nora was still holding on, and Nora would find just enough energy for another moment. In those quieter exchanges, hope shifted shapes, not a blinding flare, but a quiet warmth, like the comfort of knowing someone will sit with you as the world waits to put itself back together. And what if everyone, at least once in a lifetime, deserved such a presence, someone whose silence could cradle you just as strongly as their words? With nothing but darkness and the distant strength of Elaine's voice for company, Nora's thoughts drifted to beginnings, the ones that mattered and the ones that shaped her. She remembered being a child, staring up at a wide sky streaked with smoke from a neighbor's chimney, fascinated not by the haze but by the flash of red trucks and the determined faces climbing from their cabs. It wasn't the sirens or the shouts that drew her in, but the calmness she saw in their eyes, even with chaos crashing around them. Years later she would chase that same serenity, the wish to be a steady presence in storms, the hope of making a difference when others could not. As she lay pinned now, the distant scent of burnt wood beneath the rubble carried her back to her first real fire, a kitchen blaze, small enough to be controlled, but wild enough to leave her knees shaking. She recalled the quiet awe she'd felt afterward, realizing that courage was made up of thousands of small, trembling steps, rather than one heroic leap. In the hush between rescue attempts, Nora also remembered why she had stayed when others had faded away, or grown weary of the long nights and harder stories. It wasn't the uniform, or the rituals of the station, but the everyday kindness that slipped between grand gestures. The older firefighter who stayed late to teach her knots, the gentle humor exchanged over chipped mugs, the way someone always volunteered to sit with the shell-shocked or the grieving. Her purpose had always returned to a single spark, being the person who could offer steadiness, a calm hand, or a warm blanket in another's worst moments. Now trapped in waiting, those memories gave her a kind of comfort sharper than any painkiller. She clung to them, letting them dull the ache and the slow creep of doubt. What if, she wondered, every life was measured not by the number of battles faced, but by the quiet ways one heart could ease the weight for another? The hours crept by, and in each quiet moment, Elaine found herself piecing together the years that had led her here. She was not a firefighter by trade. Her tools had always been words and gentle hands, the small rituals of care that stitched up wounds you couldn't see. She'd worked as a nurse, then ran the station's family support nights, always believing in the power of presence and honest listening. That's how she'd first met Nora, watching the younger woman struggle to settle in after her first rough year with the department. Nora had reminded Elaine so much of herself, fiercely capable, but carrying a silent ache behind her eyes as if she braced for disappointment at every turn. Over late-night coffee, they'd traded stories, sometimes in exhausted whispers, sometimes in bursts of laughter loud enough to echo down the empty halls. Elaine remembered the first time Nora admitted she still called her mother after every shift, and the trust that passed between them then. A small, bright gift, handled gently and never forgotten. As seasons changed, their friendship deepened into something steadier, quieter, a line of comfort running beneath their separate days. Elaine became the constant shadow in Nora's life. The check-in call after long shifts, the gentle reminder to rest, the extra meal left on the doorstep, just in case. There were years when grief swept through the station, and Elaine was always there, holding steady both for Nora and any soul too burdened to stand alone. That bond was never defined by titles, but by the unspoken promise that neither would be left to weather a storm alone. It was trust built over hundreds of ordinary acts, shoulders offered on hard nights, jokes that softened bad news, a steadfastness that owed nothing to duty and everything to choice. Now, kneeling beside the ruins, Elaine understood something even deeper. The ache behind her stubbornness was love, woven from worry, pride, and all the difficult miracles of staying when it mattered most. What if, she wondered, the truest families were those we gathered along the way, in moments like this? A sudden tremor rattled the bones of the building, sending a shiver through Elaine's spine and scattering fine dust across her boots. For a long moment, the steady hum of rescue work froze. Nora, trapped below, felt the world compress around her. Stone grinded against stone, and the faint sense of open space shrunk even tighter. A chunk of brick scraped loose and slid nearby, sending a thud down to where she lay pinned. Outside, Elaine's head jerked up at the noise, heart hammering with old, familiar terror. As others around her drew back and braced, she dug her knees into the cold, stubborn ground and stayed put. Their fragile connection was suddenly shadowed by risk. Another shift in the debris, too sudden or careless, might bury hope as quickly as the ceiling itself. Nora shifted her weight as best she could to keep rubble from rolling toward her chest, her teeth pressed tight around a silent prayer. Was the promise already too much to keep? The tension in those minutes was almost unbearable, a single breathless thread stretching between hope and despair. Elaine steadied herself, forcing her voice to stay even though her hands shook. "I'm still here, Nora," she said, knuckles white as she pressed against the debris, desperate not to betray her own fear. Up above, rescue teams reorganized, the careful choreography interrupted by new instructions. An engineer called out measurements. Someone in a reflective vest argued for a slower approach. Nora listened to the chorus of nervous voices, picking out Elaine's words like a lifeline. Every vibration, every distant crack or settling of stone made her heart race, but she clung to the sound of Elaine refusing to go silent. This was a moment built on faith, faith that the people above would find a way, that she herself could wait a little longer, and that a single voice was enough to steady her through a storm of falling stone. And what if the next tremor changed everything? Could hope survive if the world shifted just once more? Pain was a steady guest, always present and pressing, dull in some places and sharp in others. Nora had lost track of how long she'd lain there, her legs heavy and cold, muscles cramping where blood could no longer move freely. She counted blinks, breaths, the distant footsteps above, anything that might measure the passing time except the slow, stretching ache in her limbs. Sometimes, the darkness wavered with exhaustion, her mind slipping toward a soft, dangerous sleep she knew she must resist. What kept her awake, what kept her clinging to each uncomfortable moment, was Elaine's voice, steady, gentle, refusing to drift away even when the world shook around them. Whenever Nora's jaw clenched in pain or her hands shook with fatigue, she listened for small encouragements from above. "Stay with me, Nora. Just talk to me," Elaine would say, as if her words could weave a safety net strong enough to hold against despair. Those simple sentences were lifelines. Encouraged by each phrase, Nora pushed herself to focus, to answer back even when the effort dragged at what strength she had left. She talked about old meals they'd shared, the ridiculous nicknames traded on chilly evenings, the comfort found in rain tapping old windows at the station. Elaine answered with stories of her own, layering hope across the silence like a warm blanket. Memories of Nora's stubbornness, jokes about the first fire she ever fought, plans for the ordinary days they would have to share after this was done. Each bit of conversation, however strained or fragmented, kept Nora tethered to awareness, reminding her body and mind that she was still needed, still loved. What if, in the end, it was these tiny exchanges, these dogged, loving reminders, that made impossible endurance possible? For every wave of pain or threatening haze of sleep, a few more words of connection sparked a flame inside her, no darkness could fully smother. Pewcase card. Elaine became a stubborn link between two worlds, the unseen one below the rubble, where Nora's voice flickered faint but determined, and the tense movement of rescuers above, weighing every choice and risk. With every update from Nora, a new pain, a shift in her breathing, a remembered detail about where she had been crawling before the collapse. Elaine relayed information carefully to the captain and the on-site engineer. She described Nora's location in soft, precise words, mimicking the way Nora herself mapped the dark, tight space below. "She thinks there's a metal beam on her right, part of a collapsed stair. She can move her fingers on one hand. She hears water dripping from above." The rescuers listened closely, adjusting their entry plans with each detail. Elaine caught their quick, darting glances as pressure mounted, but she didn't let anyone tell her to step away. Not when every new piece of Nora's struggle brought the team a heartbeat closer to finding her. Throughout the long and anxious hours, Elaine wove back and forth from the hole in the debris to the hastily set-up rescue command center. Whenever she returned, she knelt by the rubble, relaying questions the rescue team needed answered. Does she feel air moving on her face? Then listening for Nora's tired but solid response. When the team marked new rescue paths with colored tape and low voices, she stayed close, translating jargon into hope. "They're almost to the next wall, Nora. It won't be much longer." Around her, the organized chaos of the site sharpened, everyone recalibrating their efforts with every update she supplied. In the rare moments when the rescuers' frustration or fear seeped through, she steadied the group, reminding every voice, her own included, that Nora was fighting as hard as anyone above ground, and that every accurate word brought her closer to light. What if, Elaine wondered, the real rescue was stitched together not with grand gestures, but with these measured exchanges, each one a promise that Nora would not be left unseen. The rescue team moved in slow, careful shifts, every gesture measured, every footstep light with caution. They had long abandoned the louder machines, trading them instead for delicate hand tools. Buckets passed in a quiet chain, and whispered encouragements. The debris above Nora was a puzzle of broken stone and warped metal, each piece threatening to tip the balance if moved without care. Flashlights shone through gaps, tracing outlines and signaling the best path forward. Elaine watched, breath held, as a young firefighter gently pried loose a chunk of concrete, handing it backward before brushing away dust to reveal more tangled wires. At times, the only sounds were the soft rustling of gloves against rubble, the muted clink of metal, and the low hum of hope building in the narrow space above Nora's silent perseverance. What if one careless move collapsed the tiny world they meant to save? Now and then, a rescuer leaned as close to Elaine as the debris would allow, seeking guidance. She said there's a draft from her left, right? Did she mention pain in her arm? Elaine nodded, relayed details, and waited for the subtle signs. Slivers of brighter air piercing the gloom, a tremulous vibration when someone shifted too quickly. Each decision was made with solemn respect. Every 10 minutes the team paused, faces drawn and slick with sweat, to check their plan and listen for any new sound from below. As the piles of loosened rubble grew, Nora could just barely hear the difference, the scrape and sigh and shuffle of hands dedicated to rescue, inch by careful inch. Somewhere inside the narrowing tunnel of dust, new resolve bloomed, not just for Nora, who clung to the memory of their voices, but for the rescuers whose quiet determination could one day be a comfort retold. And what if, in the end, real courage was measured in these painstaking inches, the patience to build salvation grain by grain? Doubt crept in quietly, as it always does when strain drags on longer than anyone expects. Nora felt it in the lull between movements, the times when scraping and digging paused, and she was left alone with the ache in her legs and the soft, ragged shiver of breath filling the heavy dark. She wondered if the debris would simply outlast her, if the rescuers might have to stop, or if another shift might close off the path for good. In those empty minutes, fear felt heavier than concrete itself. Yet, each time those thoughts pressed in, Elaine's voice would return, sometimes just a gentle hum, or the soft reciting of a children's rhyme they once laughed about at 2 a.m. Nora let the sound anchor her, steadying the waver in her chest, and pushed the questions away. Wasn't this what being brave really meant? Not banishing fear, but moving forward in its presence, letting the voice of someone who believed in you drown out the harsh doubts of the world? Up above, the rescuers exchanged glances filled with the same nerves and bone-deep fatigue. Shoulders hunched as they worked, second-guessing every shift of rock, scanning each other's faces for permission to keep hoping. Elaine caught their worried murmurs and read the slump in their frames, the instinct to hurry at war with the knowledge that patience was the only safe way forward. More than once, someone asked if maybe they should back off, let specialists take over, or wait until the unstable wall could be braced better. Each time, Elaine offered a quiet reminder, Nora's voice, still strong, still present, still fighting. Those words echoed in the hearts of the team, rooting them to the task. They were not just saving a stranger now, they were reaching for someone who was loved, whose courage burned beneath the wreckage. So they continued, hands steady and careful, filing away the doubt and choosing over and over to let hope and courage pull them through one more uncertain hour. If doubt was the shadow, then courage, however fragile, was the morning light still leaking through. Underneath the broken world, time slipped sideways, and Nora's mind wandered to moments she thought she'd left behind. In the hush between Elaine's check-ins, she remembered the afternoon when Elaine first showed up at her door, carrying homemade soup and a stack of movies after Nora's first difficult call-out. Nora had tried to act tough, brushing off both the fear and the tears, but Elaine hadn't pushed. Instead, she just sat there, quietly sharing her own stories of messy days and nights lost to worry. That gentle patience had chipped at walls Nora didn't even know she'd built. She recalled trips to the lake in late summer, long walks through empty streets when sleep wouldn't come, their laughter bouncing off quiet buildings. It was a friendship that grew like ivy, sometimes messy, always resilient. What if all her life, Nora had secretly needed someone who would simply stay, no matter how fierce the storm? Elaine, kneeling above, had her own reel of memory running beneath the steady mask she wore for the rescuers. She remembered the nights when Nora would appear at the hospital, usually late, always tired, delivering coffee and shy questions after hard shifts. The two of them had circled around their fears for years, Nora afraid she'd never be enough, Elaine terrified of getting too close and losing someone yet again. There had been arguments, doors closed a little too firmly, long silences stretched over weeks, but always, a reaching back, a text, a joke, a slice of pie left on a porch. Elaine let the recollection of shared losses and slow forgiveness feed her determination now. Wasn't this how people became important? By surviving failures, forgiving, refusing to disappear when comfort was hardest to give? With every memory, she pressed her palm harder to the stone, sending all her love straight through the barrier, believing that maybe, just maybe, Nora could feel it too. Inside the cramped pocket where Nora lay pinned, her trembling fingers brushed against something soft and folded, wedged beside her in the gap between broken beams. She drew it closer and in the dim spill of her rescue light, recognized the fabric for what it was. A handkerchief, faded red with tiny white flowers pressed around the edges. Elaine had given it to her years ago. More a joke than a gift, after one of Nora's clumsier kitchen disasters at the station, when a cut finger and spilled tea left her embarrassed and frustrated. For when the world leaves a mark, Elaine had teased, pressing the handkerchief into her palm. Nora had carried it ever since, a secret bit of comfort tucked inside coat pockets and gear bags, always within reach, but rarely noticed. Now, beneath tons of stone, it was more than cloth. It was a thread connecting her to a safer world, evidence that someone had always known she might need a little extra care. Above, searching the sky for comfort as much as for any sign from below, Elaine glanced at her own hand. The fingers curved as if around something soft and familiar. She remembered the day she'd noticed that same handkerchief, peeking from Nora's jacket, and how grateful she'd felt, knowing her smallest gesture had not been forgotten. A wave of tenderness washed over her, sharper than exhaustion, even as she relayed rescue updates. There was such power in small things. A square of fabric, a whispered joke, a stubborn promise repeated through stone and silence. Elaine found herself murmuring a gentle reminder, voice filling the gap between them. "Do you still have it, Nora? The world hasn't left you alone, even now." It was comfort sliced from the cloth of ordinary kindness, a symbol that trust could outlast pain and distance, that even buried hope could be brightened by something as simple as a faded handkerchief. And what if, in the hardest hours, it's these quiet relics of care that hold us together when words can't quite reach? Even as exhaustion pressed heavier onto the day, Elaine refused to let her energy falter where Nora could hear it. She kept a careful rhythm, checking in every few minutes, raising her voice just enough to carry comfort, but never loud enough to hint at the worry behind her words. When she sensed Nora's answers getting softer and the pauses growing longer, Elaine improvised, drawing stories from the old toolbox of their friendship. She described in detail the slice of sky above the debris, how it had turned a strange, beautiful pink near sunset, and how, just a moment ago, a pigeon had nearly landed on a firefighter's helmet. "You'd have loved the look on his face," she teased gently. Sometimes she quizzed Nora on trivia, or invited her to remember favorite recipes they'd made together, prompting laughter or a vague, sleepy protest. Anything to keep Nora's mind moving, rooted to life and hope instead of drifting off where pain and cold could overpower her. Elaine's voice never wavered, even as the rescue site around her grew tense with the long hours. When she sensed silence stretching too thin between them, she counted together with Nora, marking each breath and each small movement as victories. She hummed old songs under her breath, let the lyrics ring out just enough so that Nora could sing along if she found the strength. When Nora mumbled about the faded handkerchief, Elaine gently encouraged her to describe it, to see if every tiny detail of the pattern remained sharp in her memory. "Tell me about the garden you wanted to plant this spring," she'd prompt, then listen with patience as Nora's tired voice stumbled through dreams lined with peonies and sunflowers. Through it all, Elaine's improvisations formed a net of presence, words, music, and gentle teasing woven together with hope, catching Nora each time fatigue threatened to pull her under. What if staying awake, staying connected, was itself an act of survival, a stubborn refusal to let fear or pain have the last word? The shape of gratitude changed as the night dragged on. Nora, wedged between the cold stone and the steel, found her breath slowing not just from exhaustion but wonder. She'd entered every emergency, knowing there might be a day she wouldn't come out, had prepared herself for the risk that one mistake could mean silence and darkness. But what she'd never truly prepared for, what no amount of training could teach, was how much it would matter to her that someone stayed. She wasn't just grateful for the rescue itself, or even the determined scraping and careful hands of the team above. What made her heart pulse with unexpected warmth was the certainty that Elaine had chosen to remember her, had refused to step away, or let her become just another sad name written under, quote, trapped. She listened to Elaine's stories, and teasing with her eyelids heavy, and even though the pain pricked constantly, it was matched by the gentler, almost shocking peace of simply not being left behind. In stolen moments of clarity between waves of pain, Nora wondered about all the other times in life when she'd been remembered. The neighbor who called when her porch light stayed off. The rookie who brought her coffee. The nurse with the extra blanket and quiet smile on a long, cold shift. She realized, with surprise, that the greatest comfort she'd ever known was not the roar of survival against impossible odds, but the quiet kindness of being seen, recalled, claimed as someone worth returning to. Her mind drifted to those she'd sat beside in their darkest hours, children frightened of smoke, elders trembling in thin hospital gowns, and how her presence had meant hope to them as Elaine's meant to her now. Wasn't it true that no one survives alone? Gratitude, she decided, was always braided into someone else's stubborn memory, the simple promise, you matter enough to wait for. And what if, in the end, rescue was measured not by sirens or medals, but by the love that remembered you when the rest of the world moved on? It began with the smallest shift, a cool draft that found its way down to Nora's cheek, carrying with it the promise of open air. Overhead, the scraping and shuffling grew sharper, less muffled by layers of broken concrete. Elaine caught the change first. The rescuers' faces brightened in the pale beam of their flashlights as each piece cleared away, revealed another hint of Nora's world below. Someone called out, voice trembling but sure, we see movement. For the first time, Elaine let herself lean closer, hearing the difference in the rescue team's instructions. No longer just careful, but urgent. Hearts lifted by concrete proof that their patience would pay off. She watched as the team coordinated wordlessly, passing heavier stones hand to hand, careful not to disturb the fragile tunnel they'd created. And what if, in that rush of progress, joy could pulse through exhaustion, infusing weary arms and blistered palms with new purpose? Nora sensed the hope even before she saw a glimmer of light. The sounds changed. Boots shifting with confidence. Hands no longer hesitating between moves. Encouragement called down instead of just up. Elaine's updates transformed too. Instead of reminders to hold on, there were gentle warnings to shield her eyes. Soon she'd see light. Nora pressed the red handkerchief to her cheek and blinked against a sudden brightness, filtering through the cracks. She let out a shaky laugh. A real, living sound, matched by cheers above as a rescuer's hand finally broke through the last stubborn beam. In that moment, hope felt, not distant or delicate, but solid as the ground itself. The gap between Nora and the living world narrowed to a breath, and she allowed herself the luxury of believing she would soon stand again in the open air, with Elaine's voice not just above, but beside her. What if every rescue, at its heart, was a promise kept, of hands that held on, and of light that arrived, slow but unstoppable at the edge of dark? As the rescuers worked steadily, the hours stretching and folding over each other, Elaine spun stories to fill the space between one heartbeat and the next. Her voice slipped down through the broken stone, calm and clear as a stream, carrying pieces of memory made vivid for Nora's sake. She talked about the crabapple tree that bloomed outside her kitchen window every spring, the one they'd once tried to bake a pie from. Never mind that it turned out too tart for even the bravest firehouse taste testers. Elaine painted a picture of the first time she and Nora had gotten utterly lost, trying to find a little antique bookstore on the far side of town, laughing so hard they nearly missed the last bus home. When fatigue threatened to settle too heavy, she told Nora about small, stubborn victories, neighbors helping to clear icy walks, kids leaving hand-drawn cards taped to the station door. Each story was a small reminder that the world was stitched together by care, kindness, and second chances. Nora let those stories wash over her, anchoring her against the edges of pain and fear. Hearing Elaine's voice wrap even ordinary things in warmth was like being led gently by the hand out of the darkness. Sometimes Nora even managed to add to the tales, a half-remembered detail about the pie, a joke about how she still got lost in her own neighborhood if she didn't follow the right scent of barbecue on summer evenings. The laughter between them was low, not loud, but it shimmered bright enough to keep despair at bay. Those shared memories filled the empty hours with substance. The stories curled around Nora like a soft blanket, promising that the life waiting above ground was real, waiting, and already missing her. And what if the most important stories were always the simplest? The ones told in the shadow of trouble, meant not just to distract, but to promise that joy was never lost, only waiting to be found again. Between stories and the rhythmic sounds of the rescue, there grew small pockets of honesty, fragile, shining intervals when even the weight of stone overhead didn't seem so final. At one quiet moment, Nora admitted, voice rough from dust and strain, "I always triple-check the stove at night. Never told anyone that. Didn't want the crew to think the old dog still gets scared." Elaine let out a tired laugh, confessing in return that she kept a nightlight in her hallway, left over from years of hospital night shifts and sleepless worry. They both rested in that gentle admission, realizing that fear, real, persistent, ordinary fear, was a thread running through every life, and that naming it out loud could make it softer. There, in the half-dark, they compared old habits, their favorite comfort foods, the odd trinkets carried in uniform pockets for luck, the songs that got stuck in their heads at the worst times. The air lightened just a bit, as if sharing these secrets was enough to shift the balance of hope back in their favor. For a little while, the conversation meandered into laughter, a bit unsteady and shy, but true. Elaine teased Nora about her messy handwriting and the way she always left her boots in the same crooked line by the firehouse door. Nora admitted that she'd never actually read the fire station procedure manual start to finish. Instead, she relied on the older guys to fill in the gaps. Elaine promised she wouldn't tell, and Nora, between winces of pain, managed a weak but genuine smile. In that chuckle, every vulnerability felt less like a burden and more like something that made their friendship honest and rare. The darkness no longer seemed absolute, not with laughter quietly threading through all the places doubt still tried to lie in wait. And what if, Nora wondered, the strongest light was found in these flickers, the shared human awkwardness and comfort, the simple mutual understanding that no one, not even the bravest, was truly alone. Out of nowhere, a hush fell over the rescue site. A deep, uneasy groan rolled through the ground, vibrating up through Elaine's knees and making the air tremble. The rescuers froze mid-motion, hands still on buckets and ropes, eyes flicking to the unstable section above Nora. For one heart-stopping moment, everyone braced, waiting to see if the building meant to hold or punish their persistence. A piece of metal gave way somewhere above, clattering down the debris tunnel, sending a spray of dust across Nora's face. She blinked hard, holding her breath as the weight above her seemed to shift dangerously close. Up top, Elaine's heart kicked sharply in her chest, fear sharpening her voice, even as she tried to keep calm for Nora's sake. "Hang in, Nora. Don't move. No matter what you hear." Minutes stretched like wire, tension so thick it pressed against every word, every hope. The rescuers whispered urgently, a hushed debate about whether to retreat or push forward. Elaine squeezed the edge of the rubble, fighting the urge to scream for speed or demand they stop, knowing either could be the wrong choice. Below, Nora felt every pebble and dust mote settle on her skin, her mind racing through survival drills, counting slow breaths, clinging to Elaine's steady encouragement above. The faint light that had broken through the rubble seemed to pulse, uncertain now. At that edge, with rescue within reach, but disaster threatening to snatch it away, courage became a shared prayer, a promise between the living and the waiting that nothing would be given up easily, not after so far come. And what if real rescue was always balanced, heartbeat by heartbeat, at the ragged edge of risk? Even as the ground settled into a threatening quiet, Nora drew a breath and called up with a steadiness she hoped Elaine could feel through every syllable. "I'm still here. Don't worry, I know the drill." Her voice, though a little rough, rang clear enough to reach past the fear twisting the afternoon air. She remembered countless times guiding frightened strangers through smoke or chaos, how even a worn-out promise could anchor both the helper and the helped. Now she used that skill for Elaine and herself, letting calmness filter into her words. "If the worst happens, just tell stories until we get a second chance. You always said I never listened the first time anyway." The scrap of humor, thin as it was, managed to cut through the tension, and she could almost hear Elaine's half-relieved, half-exasperated chuckle above. Elaine answered in kind, her heartbeat slowing, voice steadying as she squeezed the debris one more time in silent thanks. Nora's courage had always run deepest, when everything seemed most uncertain. Her words reached up like a hand from the dark, steadying not just herself, but the whole rescue crew. The team paused long enough to trade hopeful glances, the atmosphere charged now not just with anxiety, but with something much stronger, a belief that Nora was fighting alongside them, second by second, breath by cautious breath. Above ground, Elaine pushed aside her own tremors of doubt, and called back, "It'll take more than this to keep us apart. Just keep talking, Nora. I'm not ready to lose to your stubbornness." If bravery was a chain, forged link by link in the smallest words of encouragement, then for a moment, their connection held stronger than fear itself. And what if, even in the grip of danger, the quiet reassurance passed upward could keep hearts from breaking, and give everyone just a little more strength to keep going? Elaine felt the hours settling heavy on her shoulders, but she stood tall among the crowded rescue team, her voice firm without being frantic. She's still alive, and she's still herself. "Don't let up," she urged, meeting the rescuers' eyes one by one. She didn't hide the urgency in her tone, but she laced it with a clear respect for their skill and fatigue. "Please. I know you have to be careful, but she won't last forever down there." With each plea, Elaine softened her hands over the battered rubble, as if steadying it by will alone could buy another minute. Even as she pressed for haste, she prayed every movement was gentle enough to keep Nora safe. She thanked each crew member as they rotated, learning their names, repeating back their updates. Her presence was a nudge and a promise. No one above would let desperation press them into a careless mistake, but nor would they drift into resignation. The team felt her determination as much as they heard it. In stolen moments, rescuers checked in quietly. What had Nora said? Was she weakening? Each time, Elaine retold Nora's bravest words and most ordinary requests, reinforcing the humanity beneath the rubble. "She asked whose lunch you borrowed," Elaine joked with a tired firefighter, drawing a quick, surprised smile. With each encouraging reply, the pace picked up, not rushed, but purposeful. Engineers circled back, recalculating the best approach. Medics kept kits close at hand, ready not just for rescue, but for immediate care the moment Nora was free. The balance of urgency and caution was delicate, but Elaine's steady presence kept everyone anchored to both. Isn't it both the swift heart and the patient hand that make rescue possible? She dared to hope. Maybe if everyone above worked with the same stubborn devotion as everyone below, the ending to this story would be one of hands joined again in sunlight. In those final moments before rescue, time stretched itself into something slow and fragile, as if the world had stopped holding itself together by the hour, and traded instead for each breath drawn, each heartbeat fluttering in the shadows. Nora counted both, the rise of her chest, the thrum beneath her skin, while listening for any sign that the gap above was widening. Each breath felt weighty and new, packed with possibility and fear in equal measure. Dust drifted quietly through a slant of new light, swirling in golden motes above her face. Nora's awareness sharpened. She could make out the soft shuffle of boots overhead, the hopeful hush in the way Elaine's words came now, less hurried, more like gentle, careful music. Every inhale became an act of faith. What if the next breath brought rescue? What if after all those hours she was only one heartbeat away from sunlight? Up above, Elaine watched the movement of the rescue crew become almost dreamlike. Slow, deliberate, each gesture done with reverence, not just for Nora, but for the hope stitched into every arm reaching for her. She pressed her own palm flat to the stone and felt, or maybe just imagined, the echo of Nora's pulse answering back. Time lost its sharpness, ticking now only in the soft exchanges between their voices, in the faint press of fingers against the dirt, in the promise neither woman would be left alone. For a moment, the crowd of rescuers faded from Elaine's mind. There was nothing but Nora's breathing, measured out like a prayer, and the answering certainty in her own chest. It was a silence, so deep, so full, that even the city around them seemed to wait and watch. And what if, in these slow-motion fragments, the truest connection wasn't rescue itself, but the way two souls stayed tethered across every uncertain second, refusing to let go? The air between them grew very still, almost sacred, as if silence itself was a language they both had learned by heart. Through the thinnest split in the debris, Nora could sense Elaine's steady presence. A warmth, a patience, neither demanding nor afraid. Words seemed unnecessary now, swept up in the shared rhythm of breathing in, breathing out. Their connection traveled in unseen ways, a sense of gentle pressure through the stone, a pause after every exhale, the soft certainty that someone was listening with every part of her heart. Both women knew what waited on the other side of this moment, both understood the stakes, and both could trust what could not be spoken aloud. In the hush before the final rescue, everything that mattered had already passed between them, not with grand speeches, but in the sturdy quiet of two people who chose, moment by moment, to hold fast. Above, Elaine closed her eyes, leaning into that silent exchange. She no longer pictured all the dangers, or rehearsed in her mind what would happen next. Instead, she let herself feel the wordless conversation unfolding beneath her hand. Their histories, mistakes, hopes, and aches, none of it needed explanation in this strip of glowing stillness. There was no need for apology or reassurance. Love and loyalty did their own speaking, wrapping around their fear and fatigue with something deeper than comfort. Even before the first beam was pried away, before the new oxygen would rush in, Elaine could sense that Nora understood what she had tried to say all along. I am here. I will not let you go. The quiet certainty between them, delicate, unbroken, was rescue in itself. And what if, in the end, holding on didn't require words at all, but only the decision to stay when every other comfort had run out? A soft beam of light, thin as a ribbon, spilled through the gap the rescuers had carved, painting a gentle stripe across Nora's dirt-streaked face. At first, it hardly seemed real, just a brighter patch of dust adrift in the gloom. But as another stone was shifted, and the team held their breath, the ray widened, groping deeper into the dark, and Nora turned her head to meet it. Daylight felt warm against her skin, sharp with hope after so many hours of shadow. It pressed against her closed eyelids until she opened them, squinting, and saw not just the shimmer of dust but the silhouette of a glove reaching down, haloed by morning. Each heartbeat boomed in her ears as the hush above broke into cautious cheers and murmurs of relief. That single line of sunlight, cold and golden, was proof that another world existed just outside her tomb, and that she was already being welcomed home. Above ground, the crowd seemed to recoil, and then draw closer all at once, eyes searching for the sign that meant their work was almost over and the promise could finally be fulfilled. Elaine, barely able to hold herself in check, inched nearer to the opening, her hands trembling around the edge of the rubble. Her breath came quick, not from fear now but from joy too big to swallow. She whispered Nora's name, voice trembling, then steadied herself. Watching the light find its mark and chase the night from Nora's eyes, Elaine felt a wordless gratitude spill out. The world grew noisy again. Radio calls, orders, hopeful voices. But in that crack of sunlight, everything meaningful had already been said. And what if, Nora thought, the whole world could fit inside the difference between shadow and light, a difference measured only by the hands and hope that cleared the way? The rescue site shifted from heavy silence to a rising chorus of urgent, hopeful voices. Nora could hear the footsteps now. More than before, faster, pressing just above her, breaking into short bursts of guidance and encouragement. Almost there. Careful on the left. Watch her arm, came the instructions, each word ringing clearer as the last wedges of debris were pulled away. Flashlights and faces crowded the opening, framed in squares of sunlight that grew bit by bit. The rescuers leaned in, their hands gentle and sure, their words not only for Nora, but for each other, lending courage as they moved as one. She felt the scrape of gloved fingers finding her wrist, squeezing just enough to say, "You're real, you made it." Noise that once sounded so far away now wrapped around her, a living web of care, lifting some unseen weight from her chest. Up above, Elaine hovered just out of the workers' way, hands clasped together so tightly they turned pale. Each new instruction carried hope and tension, mixing into a bright, collective energy that made the crowd lean forward for a first, full glimpse of Nora. Bits of sunlight splintered and danced across Nora's face as the final barriers came free, and the rescuers called her name now, not with worry, but with the surety of reunion. A medic reached in, murmuring reassurances, counting, guiding, clearing the last fragile blocks. In that closeness, voices became bridges, Elaine's gentle whisper, running alongside the team's encouragement, filling the cracks with promise and belief. Each word was a step toward daylight, each shared breath a promise that no one would be lost to the dark while there was still strength to reach out. And what if, in the presence of so many kind voices, rescue became not just survival but a welcoming chorus singing someone home? Nora's arms trembled as helping hands reached for her beneath the final stone. Pain and exhaustion pooled in every muscle, but she summoned what little strength remained for a gesture she'd rehearsed in her heart 100 times. As a rescuer slid her arm free, Nora gripped the glove with surprising force, steady, deliberate, her gratitude pouring out through that brief, anchoring squeeze. It was not the dramatic scene of television rescues, no tears or gasps for the cameras. Instead, it was a silent litany, pressed firm into flesh and fabric. Thank you for believing I was still here, for every gentle word, every inch you risked. The rescuers met her eyes, sensing that this moment was not only survival, but the acknowledgement that each act of patience, each choice to pause and listen, had given the hope Nora needed to keep holding on. Even the youngest firefighter, the one with shaking hands and dust-spattered cheeks, stood taller, recognizing that sometimes real heroism was shared, given and received, in quiet touch more than shouts. Above ground, Elaine watched, and though her relief vibrated just beneath her calm, she did not rush forward or sink to her knees. Instead, she met Nora's gaze in the open light between them, and pressed her palm to her heart, holding it there until Nora could see. Words were unnecessary and, perhaps, would have ruined the moment's gentle weight. In that gesture, Elaine returned every promise kept, every sleepless hour spent guarding hope from the edge of doubt. As medics checked Nora's vitals and the team worked methodically around her, Nora managed a nod, and the smallest flicker of a smile, lips too tired for more. It was enough. Between those two women, and through every hand joined in their rescue, that gesture lived, a soft, enduring flame of thanks, carried not in speeches, but in touch, eye contact, and the enduring memory of what it means to be truly seen. And what if every rescue could end like this, a single purposeful gesture, echoing far beyond the dust and noise, long after the sirens fade? With daylight breaking over the battered rescue site and Nora's hands squeezed gently by each rescuer, Elaine moved closer, careful not to crowd but to be an anchor within reach. She kneeled at Nora's side, her own hands steady at last, and simply rested 2 fingers on the back of Nora's wrist, just enough touch to finish the chain that had never broken. No words, only the deep, warm knowledge passing between them. I meant it. I never left. Elaine didn't try to explain away the night's fear, or her own weary hope. She let her presence, quiet and enduring, speak for her. Her touch was a promise kept, the kind that lives in small, steadfast acts. Being there when the waiting is hardest, refusing to let the dark take someone you love. The loudest proclamations in that moment were made in silence. No fanfare, no audience, just 2 people refusing to let go, not when it mattered most. Nora, still half shielded by medics and rescue gear, could feel that promise settle into her bones. A gentle certainty that she was more than a survivor, she was someone cherished, remembered, and not lost to the world's rush. The noise and commotion of the rescue faded in Nora's heart, replaced by the steady pulse of a friendship built in ordinary days and proven in extraordinary darkness. Elaine's quiet promise needed no words to be understood. It was as sure as the handkerchief Nora still clutched and the memory of sunlight that had finally reached her face. She let herself close her eyes for a brief second, feeling the weight lift, old fears dissolve, and gratitude spill quietly through the space between them. And what if in the end, the strongest vows were always made this way, in the touch that lingers, the presence that never leaves, and the quiet certainty that some promises don't need saying to last forever? The final rescue was nothing like the movies. It was quiet, careful, each action performed as if Nora were made of glass. Medics and firefighters leaned in at precise angles. Voices pitched no louder than necessary. Every movement rehearsed but gentle. A blanket appeared, tucked under her arm with a promise of warmth, and hands braced her shoulder as they began to free her legs from rubble's grip. It took minutes that felt like hours, each stone lifted with just enough force to make room, never enough to unsettle what still needed to hold. Nora's world narrowed to sensations, hands steady on her spine, the scrape of gear, the muted encouragements close to her ear. She concentrated on those details, letting the intimacy of care crowd out the fear, the pain, even the wild hope leaping in her heart. Every team member was patient, responding instantly to the smallest change in her breath or the clench in her jaw. And what if that patience, so disciplined, so tender, was the real secret of survival, just as important as strength? Step by step, the gap widened enough for them to fit a rescue board beneath her. Medics checked her pulse, asked permission before every move, describing gently what would come next. "You'll feel a squeeze here, a lift there. Tell us if it hurts too much." Elaine stood just outside the ring, whispering encouragements no one else needed but Nora. When at last the moment arrived, Nora was drawn from her prison, with a calm steadiness that left no rush, no roughness. The world tilted for a moment, sunlight spilling bright across her battered face, and every motion slowed, a careful hand guiding her arm, another cradling her head, boots shuffling softly on loose dirt. There were tears, but they didn't blur the rescuer's skill. The delicate extraction, built from teamwork and quiet attention, felt like a final, loving chapter to a story written in trust. And what if, above all, rescue meant handling each other's burdens with hands gentle enough to never cause new hurt, even as they bravely pulled one another back into the light? The first touch in open daylight was a simple handshake. Nora's battered hand reaching for Elaine's, fingers closing around the familiar strength and warmth she'd memorized through long years and harder nights. The air was muddled with cheers, radio chatter, and the bustle of medics readying their gear, but between them, everything slowed to the beat of a pulse passed from one palm to the other. Neither spoke, the silence holding more than any words, the shared grit and love of survivors, the steady relief of a promise, not only made but kept. Nora's grip may have trembled with exhaustion, but it was Elaine's steady squeeze back that said, without flourish, "You did it. You're still you, we're still us." Dust clung to both of them, sunlight caught in the lines of their faces, the handshake bridging hours of fear and hope. Around them, the world picked up speed again. Medics leaned in, the rescue crew clapped each other on the back, and the crowd at the periphery finally exhaled. Still, Nora and Elaine held the moment, their hands joined across the threshold, where shadow turned to morning. In that brief grip was everything that mattered. The fear neither had voiced aloud, the ordinary jokes told to stave off panic, the silent vows exchanged in dust and darkness. This handshake was more than a greeting or even gratitude. It was the proof that they had both endured, together, carrying each other through. In the midst of the chaos and the flurry of relief, they carved out a quiet space that belonged only to them, not a celebration but a mutual acknowledgement. And what if all life's hardest moments could end this way? With a steady hand, patient and real, reminding you that even after the darkness, you are greeted by someone who will always hold on. As Nora sat on the stretcher, sunlight warming her face and Elaine's hand still clasped in hers, she felt a wave of humility unlike anything she'd known in her many years as a firefighter. The weight of all that effort, the hours of digging, the patience, the steadfastness, settled gently across her shoulders. Nora had always been the one arriving first, the one giving comfort, rarely the one needing it. Now, looking at the line of rescuers whose faces were damp with sweat and relief, she felt stripped of her past certainties. The world was so much larger than one person's bravery. Courage lived not just in fighting alone but in letting others help and in accepting rescue when pride wanted to refuse it. She pressed Elaine's fingers, voice rough with gratitude, and managed to say, "Thank you for staying, thank you for not giving up, on me, or the promise you made." The words were simple, but behind them was a deep recognition. She had been carried by love, as much as by skill. For Nora, the world seemed washed clean. Each sound, each hand that reached for her, brimmed with a freshness she hadn't felt since her earliest days on the crew. The sky overhead was impossibly bright. The murmurs of team and strangers alike threaded with hope. Hard days would come again, and she knew that a return to routine would soon follow. But within her now rested a different kind of faith. Faith in connection, in the quiet, stubborn loyalty that keeps people returning for each other over and over. Nora met Elaine's eyes, sharing her humble awe at how ordinary actions, repeated over hundreds of days, could suddenly become the miracle that saves you. She realized that lasting hope wasn't made from loud declarations but grown in silence, patience, and the presence that refuses to let darkness close in. What if everyone, just once, let themselves rest in the safety of another's care and found, in doing so, their strength renewed. Elaine watched as the rescue site slowly wound down. Equipment packed away, exhausted faces softening in the golden light of a hard-won morning. Her heart was filled not with triumph, but with a quiet awe at how sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was simply stand their ground and refuse to let go. Through the long hours she had felt helpless so many times, knowing she could not dig Nora out with her own hands or erase her pain. But with every whispered story, every soft word of encouragement, and every moment spent kneeling above shattered stone, she realized her biggest gift was her stubborn presence. It wasn't her skill as a nurse or her talent for fixing others' wounds that mattered most in that night of waiting. It was her promise, repeated silently, again and again. I will stay, I will not leave, no matter how dark it gets. Elaine understood, with bittersweet clarity, that true rescue sometimes grows from the person who simply refuses to disappear. In the hush that follows every crisis, Elaine saw her own reflection in Nora's tired but shining eyes. She felt the echo of all the nights she had spent sitting up with strangers, the friends whose losses became her own, and the countless gentle gestures that had gone unseen but never unfelt. Being there, holding space when others needed time to be afraid, to hope, or just to breathe, was the real heart of kindness. Now, with Nora safe beside her, Elaine knew she would carry that lesson forward into every new moment of fear or uncertainty. If steadfastness could pull one lost soul from darkness, how many others could be steadied by nothing more than company that never wavered? It was a simple power, invisible in its workings, but lasting long after the crowd's cheers faded. What if everyone, in their own small way, chose the courage to be the one who stays, quietly holding fast until the morning comes? In the quiet that followed, Nora and Elaine sat side by side, shoulders almost touching, watching as the world around them slowed and softened. The noise of rescue faded into the gentle background hum of a city waking up. Trucks idling, crows calling, the clink of equipment being hauled away. No one pressed them to speak, and for once, neither felt the urge to fill the air with words. The only conversation was the movement of light over their faces and the simple comfort of shared breath. Both women understood, deep in their bones, that something between them had shifted, a bond forged in hardship, tempered by fear, and now polished smooth by gratitude and relief. Nora traced the curve of the faded handkerchief in her pocket, feeling the weight of all the stories and promises woven quietly into their time below ground. Elaine breathed in the stillness, letting the morning's golden hush seep into her tired shoulders. There was nothing she needed to explain and nothing to hide from Nora. The silence was full, thick with meaning and memory. She glanced at Nora, caught her gaze, and they exchanged a small, knowing smile, one that held more than any retelling of the night's ordeal ever could. Around them, the world slowly stitched itself back together. The flash of a camera here, a medic's gentle pat on the arm there, strangers making coffee in battered paper cups. But the center of it all was this pool of reflective quiet, the kind that only comes when two people outlast fear and return together. How often do we rush to fill space after crisis, when it is these silences, rich and steady, that change us most? And what if the greatest comfort we can offer is simply to remain quietly beside someone who now understands the world's fragility a little better than before? Long after the sirens faded and the crowds drifted home, Nora and Elaine remained at the edge of the quiet street, a pair made luminous by what they had been through. The world wore its scars just as they did. Dust motes swirling where the building once stood, sunlight licking at the broken stone, shapes of rescue painted in the stubborn smudges left by thousands of hands. Yet it was not the ruined earth or battered helmets that lingered in memory, but the way a single touch, a steady voice, and the refusal to walk away could bridge an impossible gap. People passed by, some offering nods, warm glances, or a cup of water, all echoes of the bond that had saved Nora's life. The city's heartbeat returned, pulsing with the ordinary, but the imprint of care, shared in whispers, in patience, in promises, remained long after the wounds began to heal. As the day unfolded, and the blue stretched clean and wide overhead, that story of holding on, of being held, quietly unfolded in the lives nearby. It was there in each neighbor's offer of help, in strangers checking on one another, in the quiet pride of the rescue team repacking their gear. Nora and Elaine did not need to speak to feel the thread linking them to every person who understands the courage required to stay. The lesson was simple but lasting. Human connection, gentle and persistent, weaves itself into the cracks left by disaster, and in that weaving, something stronger than loneliness or loss is made. The memory of a hand not letting go lasts longer than any siren's cry. And what if we all took a moment today to reach for someone, not in grand gestures, but in steady presence? Who in your life needs a promise kept, or a hand that doesn't let go? Thank you for reading this far. If this story moved you, share your own thoughts or stories in the comments. Whose hand is your lifeline, and when have you stood watch for someone you love? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories that honor quiet courage and unforgettable bonds. As the hours slipped by and the world gradually found its rhythm again, Nora and Elaine lingered in the golden hush left behind by crisis. They sat quietly at the edge of the battered street, the traffic flowing slow and considerate around them, the rescue tape flapping lightly in a breeze that felt almost gentle now. Neither woman tried to shape their feelings into words. They didn't need to. The thread connecting them felt as present as the morning sun on their shoulders, invisible and strong. Elaine's calm voice, steady through every hour of darkness, seemed to dwell in the air around Nora, echoing softly even when she fell silent. It was a voice Nora sensed she would always carry, the timbre and warmth present not just in memory, but somehow in the very way she moved forward from this day. A quiet vow that some connections are written deep, impossible to erase. That promise hovered between them, the kind that persists after the smoke clears and the urgent voices are replaced by quieter sounds, footsteps on the walk home, the distant call of a dove, the laughter of new neighbors setting out breakfast. When the world grows quiet again, Nora knew, some voices truly stay. They become a part of how we meet each moment, how we dare to hope, how we show up for those who need us. Elaine smiled gently, and Nora answered with a nod, neither requiring a declaration. In that space, the unspoken was loud enough, an understanding that, wherever they both wandered, steadfast voices would rise in memory when strength seemed low. Eventually, they stood, dusted themselves off, and walked into the day, their steps light with the certainty that real presence, once offered, never quite leaves. Who in your life speaks that kind of hope into the quiet places? And when did a single promise carry you further than you thought you could go? If this ending touched you, let us know in the comments. What silent vows or remembered voices help you through? Please share, subscribe, and so you don't miss another story, remember to turn on notifications.